Welcome, everybody, back to the Sean Trey Show. I've got a really awesome guest with me today, and I would you like to tell people who you are and a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, let's not raise the bar too high. How about someone that might be semi-interesting? My name's Mike Rucker. I'm the author of The Fun Habit. Enjoy studying behavioral science, and in the day I work, or just kind of wrapped up actually, a long tenure for a wellness company. So a lot of what I do is look at upstream, things that make people feel better, either physiologically or psychologically.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What was it? There was this thing that I was watching. I can't remember whether it was a YouTube video and it was talking about people's default. Like what is your default? Are you defaulting to being more happy or to dealing, stress? Like what's your kind of baseline? And it was like looking at how you can aspire to have more positive thoughts, more happiness, more good stuff. And it was like, and I remember reading that, and I was dealing with a period of time where I'd been feeling quite down. And I was just like, what, that can be my default? That can be like, what? That's wild. How can I get there? And it seems simple, like, oh, you just be more happy. But it's not always really simple to just be happy. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. And that's a lot of what I dug into in the book. Because I think, at the end of the day, words are just constructs, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
think one of the most interesting things, living in a different culture is that breadth that you understand how much language sort of affects your subjective reality. And
Yeah.
so, especially here in the West, being an individualistic culture, we look at happiness as this end state, right? And so I think at the end of the day, we want to just feel comfortable in our own skin and feel like, the things that we're doing are adding to, this kind of collective experience that we have. And yet, especially in my field of psychology, we boiled it down to this thing called subjective well-being, where we're actually asking people, on a scale of 0 to 10, how do you feel? And like, how weird is that, right? That now you
Yeah.
have folks, myself included, who feel like they need to optimize for that. Where, to your point, we can index these things and just naturally know that they're abundant, because also what's, pretty guaranteed for most of us is that we're going to have slings and arrows of life sent at us, right? So we need that
Yeah.
emotional flexibility to deal with that. And so if we make happiness this ideal, when that doesn't happen, then all of a sudden there's some sort of fissure, right? And like, oh my goodness, like, and once we get stuck in that state of rumination, where we are kind of stuck in negative thought, we know that, that's a pretty horrible place. Because again, then like happiness is this end state, and you're not there, and you start to kind of ruminate on that gap between where you are today, which again, all of us are going to have bad days, and this, weird ideal that's out there, because you saw someone a little bit happier than you on Instagram or whatever it is.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then I think the second piece, just to finish the thought, is we do, for the geeks like me, we do seem to be preloaded to think bad thoughts. And there's, you know, probably a reason for that. Before this immense amount of information coming at us at all times, we needed to be aware of the things that were going to harm us, right? I mean, our biological systems are set up to keep us alive. So having a bias towards, is that tiger going to eat me, was probably
Yeah.
helpful thousands of years ago. But now all of these sort of artificial threats, right? Things that are outside of our sphere of influence, um, thinking about them all the time and feeling like we're constantly under attack, we know isn't helpful. And so, with work, we know we can change that, and we know there's a benefit. But I think I wanted to just make sure that I got out in answering your question that it does take work. There's like mindfulness, you do need to practice it a little bit.
Right. Well, and you hit on an interesting point there. Like the other day, my daughter was coming downstairs, and she's 8, turning 9. And our house is really safe. It's like we are like in where we live in Southeast Asia, I mean, there's padlocks on the doors. Different doors are, like windows have like no one's getting in. Like it is secure. And yet she gets really scared about going down to like to different floors without my wife and I on that floor. And I'm trying to work with her. Hey, there's nothing to be scared of. And I rationally, I'm sitting there going, come on, kid, you got to get, it's not a big deal. But then the other night, I was watching this Nature is Metal Instagram page, and it showed like it's just it's real life animals, like wild. It's like Nat Geo on like next level, and it shows some of these videos, and it showed this video where a leopard snuck up and grabbed a dog right off the family's porch in India. And it was in the middle of the night, and the dog's sitting there sleeping. And like, we totally are wired where things that go bump in the dark are terrifying, and like they are dangerous. And like our brain, there's a great book called The Buddha's Brain, Practical Neuroscience of something. And it just looks at how this is wired to not get eaten. like, like, you know what? And it's like, we don't want to get eaten by something. And so there's so much of our inner psychology that's just focusing on the negatives, because positives, there's going to be another positive down the road, but that really big negative, if you don't avoid getting eaten, there's no more. Like,
Yeah. I mean, I found it really interesting that it goes a level deeper. There's a good book in a similar vein called The Worm at Its Core. I think I might be messing up one of the words, but it's not just about safety. It's about not wanting to die. And so
yeah,
for most of us, unless we do work towards transcendence, we just don't even want to contemplate death. Like any thought, that creates dissonance in that regard, we're like, like we just push
yeah,
it away because, but the problem there is then we take time for granted, right? And so one of the benefits of being able to understand that, yeah, life isn't it, 100% safe, then we can make choices with our time,
yeah,
which we know can be beneficial. So, yeah, it's interesting on two levels, right? I mean, it's funny that you say that because just last night we got a puppy, and which is funny because it's my first podcast with the puppy. We're trying not to crate him very much, but he's like on the other side of the room because he doesn't like to be in there. Um, and I tried to do one of these where I could hear him, wanting to get out, and it was enough of a distraction that now I think I've come up with a good strategy. But I bring him up because we turn on the fireplace for the first time here, and it's a Fa one that it's gas. But he saw the fire and he was like, "F this," And I thought, how interesting, right? Because yeah, you should be afraid of fire if you're an animal, right? And
yeah,
there's a level of safety, even more so, right? Like a traditional fireplace, it's still safe, but has more risk. This one's behind glass and is gas. So no risk to the puppy, but he was, rightfully scared. And I just find that interesting that, at that level, we're hardwired, which is good, right? Because we should be, cautious until we learn better. It's interesting how much kids do need to glean from their parents because, in that conversation, kind of the epilogue with my wife, I was like, yeah, but kids still go burn themselves on the stove. Probably because the
yeah.
stove wasn't something in nature where it's going to be hardwired, right? It's a fairly new phenomena. But I think there's a lot of research, outside of my area of expertise, where just how interesting humans are with regards to transfer of knowledge from, familia places where animals seem to have, deeper instincts than us, and why that is. Probably for another podcast, right?
Right.
But then getting back to this death thing, which I have found just extremely fascinating. And that we don't want to die, and rightfully, why would you? But if you can get past that rationally and with intellect, right, then you can be like, okay, well, death is imminent, so how can I make better decisions? And I think that's back in line with what we wanted to talk about.
I love it, man. Well, and and I'm a big lover of reading works by Ryan Holiday and a lot of these Stoic things, and he's got this big thing of memento mori, and like if you can think about the fact that this everything we're dealing with is finite. And that's the beauty of it all. Like when you're eating an ice cream cone, if that ice cream lasted for, 10 months, you're not going to really enjoy that ice cream as much. But the fact that ice cream melts and that you have this brief time to enjoy it makes it all that much more rich, and why would you want to waste all your time on this stuff when you could be focusing over here? Which comes to my question is, what did you find was the biggest myth about fun and happiness? Like, what is this stuff?
Yeah, I think, the sort of biggest aha was, and it's funny because it's juxtaposed, some of Ryan's work. So, he tends to borrow from Stoicism. I tend to borrow from Epicureanism, right? And so
I
kind
love
of
it.
different. Um, but, so anyone that wants to geek out on the science, this is rooted in the hedonic flexibility principle. We know that if you're looking at the long game, enjoying what you're doing tends to be more sustainable than kind of, things like grit. And so, especially in, my field of workplace wellness, like, why, mainly look at North America, but why are we seeing vocations across, the entire spectrum having levels record of burnout, right? And
Yeah.
it's because people don't enjoy what they're doing. And so,
Right.
episodically, if you're trying to get something done, if you're trying to grind out, it's funny to say marathon because we always, kind of colorfully illustrate life's journey as a marathon, not a sprint, right? But, um, these hard things do require episodically, you know, stretching yourself, right? I mean, to grow, you do need that. If not, it goes back to the idea of not being flexible, right? Like if want to try and be immune to pain, ultimately you're going to be knocked off your pedestal. But
Yeah.
by completely devoiding it, right? We call it hustle porn now, right? Or, toxic positivity.
Right.
Like if you're not setting things up so that you are drawn to them, that they're invigorating, that you find some sort of pleasure from it, then ultimately you don't want to do it anymore. I mean,
Yeah.
there is, you can boil complex things down to its simple elements, right? And so is it 100% true that we're pleasure seeking or pain avoidance? No. I mean, there's layers to that, right? But it is a fundamental tenet of every animal, right? Like if we're really in pain, we want to escape that. And so if your job is something that every day you're like, why the F am I here? Then shouldn't that make sense, right? That's where I do have a problem with stoicism. Like growth
Yeah.
isn't in enduring pain. It's in
Yeah.
how do I, find myself in this place and actually enjoy the people that I love or, these little things that I'm trying to nurture. And so that's where I think we do need to course correct. And to answer your question, the big, like, wait a second, it's not just about the fact that I want to enjoy life. It's that these things are what allow us to do the long game and then find, some of the broader based, big pieces, like maybe exploring what meaning means to you. Because you have the vigor and vitality to now do that. You're not just like, well, life kind of sucks. I don't really even want to find my purpose.
Right. 100%, man. Well, one of the things that you pointed out there that I love that you bring that up, and I have thought about that. There was a Instagram video that I saw, and it was like one of those the hustle porn type, and it's like I wake up at 3 a.m. You know, I get going, I run my first marathon of the day. Then I do this. And then after that, after lunch, and I've gone and taped together my broken bones, I run on a second marathon. And it's like, oh, damn. And you're like sitting there going, man, should I be running 2 marathons a day? And then I sit there and go, like, hang on. It doesn't mean that, and like one of the things too that I was speaking with one guest that was coming on, and they were like talking about how the people, like, there's this glorification of sleep deprivation. It's like, no, get your sleep, man. Like, I can't function if I don't nap. Like, I living in Asia for so long, like they have a nap culture. And now I've just got this habit. If I can't take a 30, 40-minute nap, I'm slammed throughout the day, And so it's like, it helps me.
And I actually use sleep as a construct because, early on I was very entrepreneurial. And, I'm probably showing my age, but, the big influencer at the time was Gary Vaynerchuk. And,
Yeah.
his whole thing, because, when I was kind of grinding things out myself, Lost was the big show. And
Yep.
I remember writing a blog post based on a video I had seen of him of like, stop watching Lost, like, and I really liked Lost. Like, that was an amazing show.
Right.
I
It's an
liked
amazing show.
philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I meant finally there's something that's living up to it. Severance. I don't know if you've watched that yet on
I
Apple
haven't watched
Plus.
Severance. I'm actually binge watching All of Us Are Dead right now, the Korean zombie movie on
Oh,
Netflix,
nice.
the TV show. It's
There you go.
really good. We'll come back to this, but like it's the first TV show that I've noticed that's about zombies that they actually know there's zombies exist in that world. They're like, hey, this is like
Uh,
Train to Busan. Sorry, but yeah,
that's
Severance
awesome.
was good, and you were talking to me
Yeah.
about Lost in that time.
No, but I was just because a lot of times, some of the folks that have written similar work to me, they talk because we all talk about choices you make with time, right? So they really villainize entertainment and social media. And I think that, you need to understand how you use those things. But
Yeah,
the reason I wanted to bring up Lost is if you're encoding the information, right? You just told me about that show in a way that lit you up, where you could tell me the inner workings of it, right? That's
yeah,
much different than what we call passive leisure, where you're just so burnt out, you're passing out on the couch and you're watching like another rerun of Survivor. And if I asked you in 3 days, like what happened, you're like, I don't know. I was just trying to kill time. Those are two very different experiences, right? And so
yeah,
um, I think, getting back to the point, in the 90s we were championing sleep deprivation, right?
yeah,
And we really quickly learned that that's actually one of the biggest productivity killers. And so what I find enjoyable, because I kind of got in front of it, is that we're now learning that about leisure and fun. Like, the second biggest productivity killer is if you're not enjoying what you're doing. The problem with it though is that it's a slower burn, right? With sleep, you're going to
yeah,
learn real quick. Plus you have strong advocates. The reason I brought up Gary Vee is he's a very nice guy. He gave me some of his time, got to interview him. If you see any of his stuff now, he talks about a balanced life. So complete
yeah,
180 from the stuff he was sending out, in the 90s. You got folks like Huberman and all these that talk about how important sleep hygiene is. But yet we don't talk about how enjoying some of the things that you do are also super important to productivity. And
yeah,
so, but when you pull it back, the folks that are enjoying what they do are, again, some of the most successful folks. Or especially if you look at it longitudinally, right? I mean, there are folks that do have these sprints, and that's the last piece I'll kind of bring up so I don't introduce too many new ideas. But we champion these things through survivorship bias because we only look at that like 2 months, right? We assume
yeah,
that that's what needed to be done in an entirety. But if you do, check in with these folks afterwards, they're like, and then I rested 6 months, right? Or
yeah,
whatever it is, or they were very young, right? It's someone like myself who's in their 50s. I had an amazing conversation with a serial entrepreneur, a gentleman by the name of Noah Kagan. He runs AppSumo, so a lot of kind of entrepreneurs know his work. And he was like, in the 20s, grinding it out was great for me because I did it with my friends. We would get a bunch
yeah,
of beers, we would do hackathons. Like, that wasn't really work, even though, someone from the outside would be like, well, you're still writing code. And he's exactly right. Like, if if you're succumbing to kind of hustle there, like, is that, really like a work product where you're giving your time away? And I would argue he's right. In that context, yeah, burn the candle at both ends because you're having so much fun and you have the
yeah,
resilience to do it, right? But then we look at that as the blueprint, and we know that in mass, the majority of folks are going to fall off the ledge, and yet we still talk about it like it's the ideal. N- there's no one that can replicate David Goggins. I think
right.
that's who you were alluding to, or at least, and so why would you hold him up as that? This will be the last anecdote. I remember me and my friends in high school, we all wanted to get big, right? Especially what we could see in the mirror. So we would buy Muscle and Fitness magazine. We had no business following those exercise routines. All those guys were on like, steroids you probably can't even get today, right? That were meant for horses and stuff. And yet we're copying their workouts, right? and we were wondering why they we weren't, getting big checks. Well, of course not, because we weren't professional bodybuilders. We had no business following that blueprint, and yet, that's what we do so much, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I get again, the rub is that oftentimes, if you do scale back a little bit, you're more productive, but it's really hard to get out of that. In fact, I think, for a lot of us, it's the work to be done. I am addicted to hyper productivity, so I'm throwing a huge rock at a glass house. And yet, when I can follow, my own advice, I see that I'm more productive and the work's better.
Yeah. We had a barbecue last night upstairs in my house. And it was like we had we had the space that we had remodeled years ago upstairs. I love my mother-in-law, but she's a hoarder. But she grew up in the middle of the Vietnam War, in a poor family. And it's like there's very much reasons that she held on to stuff. And then you have the pandemic that came along, and it was like all of that core programming just got boom. And she started stockpiling everything, and nothing got thrown away. I mean, we were talking massive amounts, and it was just random stuff like flower pots. And like suddenly we had like 200 flower pots on the roof. And we're like, why do we have that? It ain't even for survival, man. It's just like 200 flower pots. Why do we have 200 flower pots? Well, you might need one someday. Well, we don't need 200 of them, And so we cleaned out the space. We gutted it. My mother-in-law's traveling for 10 days, and my wife was like, it's time. And she leaned in and she cleaned it out. And it was interesting because there's this great teaching in Taoism, and in the Tao Te Ching, they talk about how a cup is only useful from what's empty. The space that is really serving you with a cup is that empty space inside. And so there's this idea that we want more, fill all your life up with all this. But the reality is sometimes you need to take things away so that the stuff that you're actually doing has a place, and for me, going up and sitting for that barbecue, because I'm always like, go, go, go. I got, working these long weeks, and bouncing multiple projects, jobs, and it just doesn't always give you more. And I see it's getting worse for a lot of these young influencers now. Like I was talking to this one team for this one very successful YouTuber and his editing team. I have an editing team here, and I was like, said, hey, we can help you with some of your editing. Like my team is really good. We can do great work for you here in Vietnam. And he was like, all right, here's how we work. We work normally about 18-hour days. I'm doing about 7 days a week. We don't normally take weekends. It's just like, I can't even ask my editors to do that. I won't ask an editor to do that. And like, let alone one. He's like, yeah, it's normally one person that does that. And I said, but why? But why? And and I kind of had this moment where I was like, well, I would have loved to have that contract, that extra money, but I'm not putting myself through that, and I'm definitely not putting my team through that. I'm not going to ask an editor that I have on my staff to come in. All right, buddy, you ready for a roller coaster? It's not
Right.
worth it. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's been a lot of good, I mean, it's old ideas, but they're being resurfaced with regards to building any system. And I think it's just natural to always think that additive is better. And
Yeah,
so there's some good thought leadership about no, actually, unfortunately, it's now getting villainized, rightfully, in my opinion. Um, what's happening in the States is just really blowing things up. But I think, at a healthy level, figuring out where those are there are inefficiencies and trying to start by removing um, in the fun habit, with regards to just your schedule. I mean, I don't want to prescribe having more fun to an already busy to-do list, because that's essentially right, like a facet of toxic positivity. Like, I know you're already busy, but now fit in fun, right? And so the whole idea is, what can we remove first? And I think that's true in any system. Again, at healthy levels where you're not disrupting and creating these, crazy ripples that are hurting people. Um, and so doing that thoughtfully is generally an interesting step. And then constraints, are so important, yet we forget about them. We know that they help productivity. Uh, I talk about John Cleese's wisdom there in the book, about creating, and you must know this, from acting, like you create that safe space because the game is going to end. It's not this long thing that's going to have lasting impact. And if there's a takeaway from it, great. If not, then you didn't waste a lot of time and you kind of had fun within that space. Um, and then just, trying to get anything off your plate. When you talk about those long days forever, again, if it's not capped by like, okay, well, maybe we'll entertain this for a sprint. Like, check in
Yeah.
with that guy from a year, and I think we know exactly where he's going to be.
You know
He's
what
either going to
album?
have,
I saw on his LinkedIn post. He posted on LinkedIn that he is taking time off to reevaluate and see where.
fucking, you know,
Yeah. He's like, this guy tried to loop me into all this, and then he quit. And I was just like,
what's the sad part there is I don't know this person's story, so we'll leave it in a hypothetical realm. But
hypothetical
checking
realm. Yeah.
in with those folks, because I really do like the creator, space as well. Somehow I've been invited in, and with a lot of these folks, and they've been very kind to me, and they'll still prescribe to that idea, like, oh, something went wrong, like I must have not done it right. Like, no,
Yeah.
you just didn't, again, make it enjoyable for you or the ones around you, you know?
Yep.
Um, and so it's cliche, but I do think that's where, to the extent you can't remove the outcome, because then why are you doing it, right? Especially if you're trying to turn it into a profession. But if you can wait on the outcome, I think it was Naval that talked about how, yeah, I'm going to mess up his quote, right? But you know, the basic sort of analogy is how can you eliminate the time between the idea and the action, right?
Oh boy.
And so you want to think fast and take action fast, but you need to be patient with regards to the outcome, and that means, right, not burning out your team, not burning out yourself, like knowing the
Right.
outcome will come if you're being honest about the work. Because if you just constantly worry about the outcome, you make odd choices, right? I mean, we talk about
Yeah.
this all the time in all facets of life. You tend to start to want to cheat. You find weird, you know, it's just like in the SEO world, weird backlinks and stuff that might work for a week, but a year later, your site's going to be offline because it was all nonsense, anyways. Um,
Right.
and then again, you're not, whether it's sleep, enjoying yourself, whatever it is, you're not going to be drawn to it. You're going to put a
Yeah.
post on LinkedIn and said, I don't know what happened to my life. I'm taking a big long break.
Right. Well, that leads me to ask this next question: how can busy people, add more fun to their daily lives?
So, I mean, there's a host of different tools. That's I take a pragmatic approach here, right? Because if you talk about it kind of from an ideology standpoint, you might miss the mark. Because for some folks, stoicism might be the right frame, right? Like I want to feel this. I'm at a stage where I, want to feel like I'm kind of grinding it out because that is enjoyable, right? So I'm really careful here. But if you find that in your 168 hours, you're not enjoying it, like you're like, I don't even want to do this anymore, then we need to correct that problem, right? So part of it could be reframing, some of those aspects, like what am I doing this for? Where is the constraint? Like, after 6 months, am I not going to do this anymore, but I'm willing to give some away right now just to see whether or not this is going to work because I know it's going to lead to something bigger. Um, is it looking and auditing your time very pragmatically? Like, again, the editing thing. I actually realized that I don't like this because I hate editing, but if I could outsource this part of it, then the rest of the journey becomes great. And,
Right.
Again, being immersed in the creator community, I am surprised that like folks are correcting their own audio transcript and, like, oh, that's the longest part of my day. It's so hard. Like, why are you doing that?
Yeah.
Especially now in AI. And so that's just one example, but like figuring out what are the parts that you could remove because that becomes extremely important. And then, hopefully you're not adding back work in, you're finding, opportunities for renewal. Again, this goes back to kind of that hedonic flexibility principle. Maybe it is because you've taken no time off the table for yourself, to get back into guitar. I see you have guitars like
Right.
that, or whatever it is that lights you up. And so you're so devoid of joy in your life. It doesn't matter what the work is, right? And so, like, how can
Yeah.
you create that space so you actually enjoy it? Um, and then there can be simple, low level sort of behavioral science interventions. Like, is it getting with the right people? Is it that you're just
Mm.
so done with your four walls that if you go and start doing it, if you have the privilege of being a solopreneur, getting in a coffee shop where you're just around positive energy again, or is it just adding music? Like, you've just been so heads down, you're in an environment that you just is suffocating or stifling, and so recreating that space is enough, right, to lift you above that threshold. And then I know, because I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts, I think really being grateful. I'm not a fan of prescribing journaling because we know that can be harmful. When someone feels like it's a practice, it's not enjoyable. But if you can figure out how it works for you, and then figuring out what were the positive parts of your day, again, very pragmatically, right? Not in this kind of mystical realm, but you start to identify, like, oh, these are the core elements that are lighting me up. And it doesn't work all the time, but for a lot of folks, then they'll start to try and incorporate more of those elements because they're like, this is what I really do like to enjoy. It gives them more pieces to the puzzle, right? Instead of just habituating our lives, which we're not indexing a lot of thoughtful um, elements to how our day is constructed, by kind of dumping it and figuring out what you're grateful for. Then you can be like, well, I'd like to add more of these aspects into my life. So all of those tools, I'm not going to bore you with any more elements from the book, but I kind of packaged them in this thing called Savor. So I found those kind of being the five best areas, right? Again, kind of story editing or reframing the things that you're doing if you look at them differently, can they be more enjoyable? Activity bundling, can you add something as simple as music or, again, different people into it? The only one we haven't talked about is variability. Is some of it just putting that down for a little bit because it's gotten so mundane that you enjoy it, but you just done it for so long, you don't need to do it anymore. This is more for
Mm.
like content creators that, maybe want to publish a book or whatever. Like, is taking a break what will kind of, patch that up where you've just been working at it for so long, you're log jammed. And so you're not contributing, to it getting better. You're just kind of trying to push rope. And so
Yeah.
a lot of times you can find just a small break from that. You reinvite yourself back to it and you're like, oh my gosh, okay, because you've had some breakthroughs, you've been able to re-engage with nonlinear thinking, right? Which becomes really hard if you're burnt out on what you're doing.
You're preaching to the choir. I remember that I had a coworker that had weathered through some tough times with the company we were both at, and he just was burned out. And there was no amount of doing anything that was going to change that. And I remember seeing a post by him a day or two ago. He moved to a new place, met a new person, met a new partner. He got married. He looked so happy. Like, all his photos were just like, I'd never seen this person smile. And suddenly he was just this different person. And I was just like, there were so many different things that he, needed. And, you could have preached positivity to him for days, but the reality was he needed a change. He needed a change. He needed something different. And when he got it, he lit up like like 4th of July. He was so happy.
Yeah, and I'd like to take that opportunity to make sure, that it's stated that what's going to help one person isn't going to help the next, right? I think that's another big thing is that we'll latch on. And it's so unfortunate, let's take gratitude journaling, for instance. That can be really helpful for some folks. And again, we know, it's been empirically shown to hurt some folks,
Mm.
especially if you are someone who ruminates and you're like, I can't think of anything to be grateful for today. It's like, well, then there's different work to be done. And if you're, burnt out, there's different kind of schools of thought on it, but let's just stick with kind of the main line, 7 different stages. Like, you're now at a clinical condition, right? Like you reach depression because of your state of burnout, prescribing fun things to do is the last thing you should be doing, right? Like it can
Yeah.
be really helpful in the first couple of stages. Like, how can we course correct this, and help you, with work life blend. But if you're like, the world sucks, my life sucks, like, again, adding more homework is not going to be helpful. We need to figure out how to get you back to baseline. And that, again, I don't know your friend's situation, but a lot of times you just aggressively changing things up can be that,
Yeah.
because then you can put the pieces back together. In fact, I think that's what we saw a lot in the pandemic is, you saw, I've seen some interesting parallels to, fight or flight that, because people have different styles with regards to how they, react to trauma. And so, and again, it's fight, flight, or freeze, right? So the folks that had a proclivity to freeze weren't doing much change. They just wanted it to be over, right? And then
Mhm.
the folks that had a proclivity to fight, they got hyper productive, right? Like, oh, I'm going to work my way out of whatever the f this is because nobody, had, and and then, but the flight people that kind of took a step back, those folks like, um, kind of reconstructed their time and reevaluated what they, you know, thought was important. And I think that was the most interesting, having the luxury of introspection in a way where you're like, okay, I do want to get back to normal, but I don't want to get back to whatever normal was before this.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and there was a real sort of, you know, awakening, I think. Um, it needed to get recalibrated again because the great resignation, I think, again, some folks didn't think through, the entire corpus of their choices, but I think it did lead to a lot of good where people understood that they shouldn't give it all away.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's interesting because yeah, what you said there, that there's not one size fits all. I remember there was this researcher on stress that came to my university, and he was, I can't remember his name right now, but he was one of the world leaders on stress, and he did all these baboon studies. And I remember raising my hand, and I was like, well, he depressed everyone in the room, talking about how stress was this horrible killer. And we were just like, oh my goodness. It was, I raised my hand, and everyone's like, shut up, Sean. You don't raise your hand. This guy is like too big and famous. And I was like, is there any way to undo this? Because it's like, this is terrifying right now. Like, we're all going to die really soon because of all the stress in our life. And he started cracking up, and he's like, well, yeah, well, you found that when you remove the stress, these animals started getting better. And then so I was like at that time I was like, right, yoga's the thing. And I was like, is yoga the answer? And he's like, no, definitely not. Well, it might be, but it might not be. And I was like, what does that mean? He's like, if yoga's your thing, then yeah, it is your thing. But maybe it's not your thing. Maybe fly fishing is your thing. Maybe going and lounging and playing Xbox is your thing. Like whatever it is that brings you that joy, you got to figure it out for yourself. Remember the old movie City
Yeah.
Slickers? Curly holding the finger up,
Yeah. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
one thing, and Billy Crystal, the whole movie is trying to figure out what that one thing is. And the end of the movie, he finally figured out that one thing that is the meaning of life. It's different for everyone. It really is your
Yeah.
thing, and that's what you got to figure out.
It's funny because I remember you referencing, I think the last episode I listened to was the endearing one about leaving relics for your daughter, which I definitely resonate with because I'm trying to do something similar. My daughter's a little bit older, but I end up writing her notes whenever there's a big thing, and I'm just kind of collecting them. Um,
That's awesome.
so doing it more analog than digital. But I remember you bringing that up, and it's funny. Maybe this is bringing everything full circle. But we'll move on quickly because I know not everyone, eh, probably is familiar with the show. But that's what's so interesting about Severance is, it's got so many layers, and so I'll make this real quick. But one of the premises, Ben Stiller talked about it, is that in the show, right, they essentially sever your being from work. So when you get to work, it's a brand new version of you. So you understand how the world works, but you have no context of anything else. And he's like, that's essentially what we are when we're babies. Like, there's all sorts of different cultures, all sorts of different religions. This isn't Ben's idea. This is me kind of, you know, uh, building off of what you talked about in your podcast, with regards to the City Slickers reference, is that, um, you know, we get to kind of decide. And I think that's what's the beauty of life, is that, at the end of the day, we can build it for ourselves, and some of it's going to be dictated by culture, whether you prescribe religion, probably your ethos. But you do ultimately get to build a lot of it towards the end. And especially for someone my age, you know, kind of in the midst of this second mountain, you've collected enough data, you should still have, an open mind. But now I can start to play with it. And I find that very fun, especially in the context of having children, right? Where you see the wonder and the fresh nature of them seeing new things.
Yeah.
And just making sure that you're not so rigid, right? That everything is predetermined. That you kind of look at it like, what is this meant to be? And how do, whether it's legacy, whether it's, self discovery, whether you're more advanced than me and it is hopefully, an invitation to transcendence, whatever it is for you, it is a really neat place, right? Because we do get to decide if we're open to it.
Yeah. I love that, man. It's interesting too, because we are starting to see um, a greater awareness for uh, that the system needs to get fixed. And it's interesting because there's some pushback. I was reading about how Gen Z, there was this article, and it was a big debate when I read this article, that Gen Z, the Gen X and Boomer doctors are angry at the Gen Z doctors, because the Gen Z doctors are like, I'm not working, 18-hour days. I am gonna take my days off. And, if someone needs help, they can go to the on-call doctor. I'm off. I'm resting. I'm taking care of myself. And then the boomer doctors are like, this is a calling, this is a mission. And it's like, both of them have a fair point. You know what I mean? But it's interesting because people are looking at this idea of um, their own wellness. Like if you're burning yourself out so that you can help someone else, is that a good thing? Are you living the principles that you're sharing to your patients? Like, it's an interesting place but we're at least starting to talk about it.
Yeah. And I mean, social normative behavior is really intense, and, it's hard to circumvent that, right? I think the sort of construct I've looked at the most is meritocracy, because it drives so much of what we do, right?
Yeah,
Especially, obviously, it sounds like you and I both work, with quote unquote influencers or creators, and this sort of artificial currency that a lot of them judge themselves against, right? Likes,
yeah,
followers, things like that. It's all
right,
contrived, right? We made it up. It's a system we made up. And so, like, what does that mean, right? It means that you are to some degree beholden to the social normative behavior of the system that you said you want to play in. And so, the physician one I know well, academically, because my what I did for practicum was work with physician burnout. And you're right, there's an old guard and a new guard. And like, so which one's right? I agree with you wholeheartedly. That I actually have an opinion, so I could tell you which one I think is right. But those are systems that they both, opted into. And,
yeah,
um, you know, and then medicine is really interesting. I'll move on quickly from this, but because it's kind of a greater good argument, like that one has levels to it, right? And
yeah,
especially in the West, where we're making a lot of money and we're not having the same sort of outcomes as some of the more socialized, but at the same time, you know, uh, with regards to outliers, we're doing a little bit better. So it's like, that one is a messy argument. And unfortunately, with messy arguments, you can create straw men and almost always sort of make yourself believe you're right. you know?
right,
But at the end of the day, like, physicians are people too. So we need to protect them. And what is clear is that 18-hour days for anybody, unless you're superhuman, is not a long game. I mean, you're seeing, even these old timers leave the vocation in to the point that we now send most people to nurse practitioners, not physicians, right?
Yeah.
And so, not knocking on NPs because they're good people, but they don't have the level of expertise a physician does just by objective reality, right? Because of the amount of experience you get as a resident. So, um, you know, and you could kind of supplant this to any vocation or sort of area, because there are levels. And that's why I think first principles are, um, you know, kind of having a renaissance themselves, because you go down to like, what is the core idea? Okay, so the core idea with regards to this example of physicians is, let's allow people to work in a sustainable way, because if they are
Yeah.
drawn to medicine, whether it be money, because that's another kind of funny thing I think of the old guard is like, they don't understand why Gen Zs are willing to make one third of what they did, because it
Yeah.
is a very lucrative profession in the States. And if you work less, you make less. And they're like, well, wait a second, we don't want to sort of undermine the profitability of this vocation. Where Gen Z's like, I just want to treat people, and again, as a generalization, because I've read some of the same.
Totally understand.
Yeah. And so, like, again, but okay, so let's get back to the most basic level. We just want to protect these folks so they don't leave the vocation, so that we have good
Yeah.
doctors, right? And that goes for NPs and any allied healthcare provider or nurse as well. Uh, you know, um, and so, but again, to your point, and I'm agreeing with you, it's sticky, right?
Well, let me ask you this one. What simple habits do you have to help you balance work, fun, and your health?
So I'm again, I think I admitted this early on. I, all of us write and research things that we need the most, right? So I
Right?
certainly was addicted to hyperproductivity. And so for me, it's taking stock in, are the things that I'm doing things that I want to be doing, and are they things that I enjoy? And
Yeah.
so it's those check-ins, not at a cadence that is prescribed or feels mandatory, but taking the time to be like, okay, have I spent time with my children in a way that I want to? Am
Right?
I approaching all aspects, um, of life in a way where I'm valuing things equally? In fact, there's a book by Bloom that came out this year, the five areas of wealth, I believe. Again, probably missing one of the words, but that's supposed to be gangbusters, similar to Atomic Habits was. And I think because there is this awakening, right, that we should be looking at wealth across multiple domains.
Yeah.
And so I'm only bringing that up as an example to answer your questions. That's what I'm trying, like many others, to value things in a way where there's balance, so that am I making enough money? Am I honoring my friendships in that same in a value class that seems like there's good parity? Am I valuing my time in that way? And am I valuing my health? Am I not pulling from the sleep bucket to make the other things? And where can I find
Right.
that balance? And so doing that in a mindful way, instead of just you know running on autopilot, like so many of us do, because life is intense with so much coming at us all the time. It's
Right.
easy to get on the hamster wheel, because then we don't need to think about it, right? We don't. There is no debate. We just do what's in front of our face. But we also know, again, from Bronnie Ware's work and others, that you do that long enough, and at the end of that hamster wheel, you know, then you're in an old folks home wondering where the F time went.
Right. It's it really is a balancing act, and I think that that's where, um, for me, I it just this year, and I've been kickstarting my wellness routine again, because my wife last year I worked hard, and my wife and I were looking at photos, and I was just like, wow, I don't look as good as I did a year ago. What happened? She's like, well, you worked too much last year. You were doing 60-hour weeks, and it's like, it's a bit much, and I was like, well, it was needed at that time. She's like, maybe, but then now you got to kind of swing back the pendulum back the other way, and it really is about balance. I studied Chinese medicine, and I am still finishing my doctorate in Chinese medicine. And one of the things that we are required to do is to study Tai Chi. And I studied many martial arts, but judo as well. When you're doing a judo throw, one of the things is like you push back and then you pull forward. Like, you have this thing and you just step out of the way. Like the really good judo throw, you're getting out of the way and the person just kind of falls because you set things up, you moved in front of them, and then the person goes over. And it's like one of the things that you have to look at is there is a time to push and a time to pull. And there's a time to, and there's just this ebb and flow. I grew up in San Diego, LA and San Diego for high school, all over California. But for my high school years, we were down in San Diego. And I spent a lot of time surfing. And when you get into a wave, and I was just in Maui with my daughter, and I was teaching her about how to read waves. And she's like, wow, hey, is that a wave coming right now? I was like, no, we're in a slow period. And she's like, well, what should we do? Should we be doing something? And I said, no, when the waves are not coming, you just sit and wait. Because when the waves come, it's going to be a lot of intense action. So you just have to recognize the flows and the seasons and the shifts. And it was fun because my mom took a picture of me in the middle of one of those moments. And it's just me against this sky. And I'm just sitting there with my daughter. And we're just sitting on our boards, just chilling. And I was just like, at that moment, I was like, when someone asks me, what is wealth? I'm going to remember that moment. Wealth is the ability to sit there and enjoy that wave. It wasn't anything monetary in that moment. It was a physical thing. It was a awareness thing. I was wealthy in that moment because I had a cool experience and I was with someone that was of value to me or, important to me. So I love that you were talking about these different categories of wealth. It's something that, especially on my financial podcast, no one talks about that. They're always talking about numbers and how to make those numbers count. And it is very stoic. Suffer now so that you can prosper later. Well, what happens if later doesn't come? What happens if you save all that money and you work really hard and you have a stroke at 45 because you're, working too damn hard? Shouldn't there be more balance built in? Just my questions,
Yeah. No, but I love it. In fact, I don't even want to comment. I would rather just absorb that moment in the water because I think you nailed it. It's something that, to go back to your previous question, just to kind of put a point on it is what I'm working on. Because, the most valuable time is the moment that we have in front of us, right? And we can play
Yes.
all sorts of games, and I mean games in a good way, not pejorative, right? Like play the financial game when that's the right time. But so
Yeah.
many of us would sit on that board because we have that space and worry about the things on our to-do list and complete. And I will tell you, when you're in that mode, you're not encoding information, so you're going to totally you're not going to have that picturesque memory, right? Because your brain's working on something else. And so many of us throw away those moments to just, again, whether it's rumination or, in our head about the future, something that's not real. So that's amazing, man. I'm glad that you were able to have that.